Bill and Kelly Show is recorded at Studio A at Executive Suite Squared in beautiful Hammond, Indiana. Now, here's Bill and Kelly. Hello, and welcome to the Bill and Kelly Show. With us today, we have Kevin Ballard, who we just recently were so fortunate to be introduced to at the Highland Unite Against Hate rally that just recently took place in Highland. And Kevin was the MC, which, again, Kevin, you did a tremendous job. And I want to tell people that was extremely powerful and moving. The imagery that the students presented was just absolutely powerful. So welcome to our show. We're so honored to have you on our show today.
Thank you so much, Bill, for having me. It's such a pleasure to be on your show and talk to you this evening.
The honor is all ours, believe me. So why don't you tell us a bit about yourself, where you're from, where you're raised, and what do you do today?
Okay, so I'm originally was born and raised on the south side of Chicago. So my parents, they pretty much, my mom is from the South. My dad was raised in Chicago. And so, like many African Americans, my mom's family migrated to the North, and my dad's family, the generation before, migrated to the North. So obviously, they met in Chicago, got married, and hence I was born in Chicago as well. And so, growing up on the south side of Chicago, what I started to learn at an early age or appreciate was just like the camaraderie amongst just all of the people there. You know, Chicago sort of has this image that's always portrayed in the media, but believe it or not, it's a place where you find some of the friendliest people. And so I I love Chicago, even to this day, regardless of what may happen in the city. There's this sense of pride knowing that you came from Chicago and that you went through certain, not necessarily challenges, but you went through certain experiences that really shaped you to make you who you are. And I can honestly say that Chicago has shaped me into the man I am today. Grew up in the Roseland community, as a matter of fact. And so from there, I ended up graduating from Hyde Park Career Academy, and then went to the University of Illinois, where I studied business and got a degree in marketing. So my life was pretty much, working in corporate America when I first started. So I worked for Fortune 500 companies, and then I found myself gravitating toward education. In education, I feel like I was able to find a little bit more of my creative side, and I found that I had a passion for teaching. So I started off as a substitute teacher in actually Homewood Flossmoor because my family moved to the suburbs. And from there, I went on to work in higher ed. And so I've been working in higher ed for probably the last 14 to 15 years or so. And I really enjoy it. And today, I'm a father, a proud father of two lovely young ladies, and I've been married to my wife since 2007. And, just happy to be living in Highland and raise my family here and just living what we call the American dream and doing our best job every day to make sure that we inspire our kids and just the people around us.
And may I say, you have a beautiful family. I met your wife, and I believe some of your children were there too, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, both my daughters were there.
Yeah, beautiful family. Let's dive right into this. It's a difficult conversation, but it's got to be had in this day and age. So why don't you give us your view, specifically being raised in Chicago, which is probably one of the most diverse cities in the United States. About human rights. You, as growing up in Chicago as an African American and being exposed to different cultures, what is your view? Where you're at specifically with your generation?
Yeah, so I'm a Generation Xer, which I'm at the end of Generation X, which and a few more years I probably would have been at the beginning of millennial. But when we grew up, there was a sense of pride to learn the history, right? To learn about the struggle of the people that came before us. And not only did our parents teach us about this struggle, but it was prevalent within our classrooms. So some of the education and curriculum that's set up today, where some of history, unfortunately, the longer we go on, it kind of becomes whitewashed, so to speak. But, we learned about, all of these great civil rights leaders. It wasn't just about Martin Luther King or Malcolm X. We learned about so many different people who made contributions. And so there's a sense of pride that these human rights activists were heroes. They were heroes who are equivalent to the soldier that goes off to war. It's just that they're fighting a battle here to make sure that people have equal rights. And so Chicago had a great influence in shaping my lens on human rights, because not only was it preached, you have different communities within Chicago, although it's a diverse city, it's still very segregated
Mm-hmm.
at the same time. So you have to go into a particular neighborhood you know, to hang out with your Mexican friends typically. A lot of times people of different races aren't blended in certain neighborhoods, but more recently you have a lot of mixed income and mixed neighborhoods now.
Right.
So just thinking about people like, Jesse Jackson, who I know is often controversial, but, seeing him on the news, seeing Mayor Harold Washington. Actually, I remember when he passed away and I was in line outside of his funeral. A gentleman who fought for equal rights and was just a man of the people, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what I realized very shortly, probably by the time I was 7, was that, growing up with my skin, there was going to be some things that might be a little bit different for me. It's not that my parents said anything, you just kind of knew it, right?
Right.
And so looking at the things that have happened over time, looking at some of even my own personal interactions with police officers, just some of my friends, how that kind of shapes your view on human rights issues, looking at some of the struggles that, some of our parents had, within the workforce, doing everything they were supposed to do. That shapes your views on human rights and diversity, as well as just really looking at the community as a whole and just loving the community and seeing that there are mothers who are working 2 or 3 jobs sometimes to support their kids, right? And maybe they work hard, they may have education, but they never get ahead. You see that human rights is a big issue, not just within the African American community, but in general, it is a huge issue within America, being able to have those basic civil liberties and rights can really propel communities a long way, not just economically, but it can empower them. And so, as I have gone through things in my life, you always have that lens on, especially as an African American. It's hard to not have that lens and look at the world from a human rights perspective. But what I will say is it makes you more mindful. It makes you appreciate the things that we have been able to accomplish. And then it helps you to really empathize with the plights and struggles of people of other races, ethnicities, and some of their challenges. Or even if, there's an issue that maybe women have because of their their sex, right? Women still are fighting for rights as well. African Americans are still fighting for rights. Native Americans are still fighting for rights. So you would think we are at a point where people would understand that, but we are still fighting for these basic things.
Right. And you mentioned Harold Washington, so I want to go
Yeah.
back to that because there are pinnacle moments in time where the African American plight was so great, the equalization of rights, the fighting that Martin Luther King, John Lewis, who fought beside him, were so important. But then some things happened. There were some African Americans that were elected to office, such as Harold Washington, the first black mayor of Chicago. And then my hometown, Richard Hatcher was elected. And so those were pinnacle moments in a time that sent a statement that we are going to be represented. And
Right.
and if you remember those periods of time, they followed some unrest, and
Absolutely.
so that it was really a statement. And then fast forward, President Obama was elected, which created another statement, and people actually felt that they were truly represented at the highest level, not just in the United States but in the world. But things are changing, And with that, and that's something I want to talk to you about, the migration of our political parties and how they become different, if you will, especially after, even though we've had elected officials, people rise to um, power that actually represent their people. Where do you view our two political parties now? What do they seem like compared to, say, 10 years ago?
Yeah, I would say at this point, there definitely is very little agreement amongst either party. And, in order to move ahead, I think that we have to kind of look at, well, why did we get here? Why are we here at this point right now? And when you take a look at the deregulation of the telecommunication industry, that created a lot of different platforms, right? So you had a lot of shows that they weren't broadcast on the radio anymore. So you had a lot of people who started to create shows who were, ultra conservative. And then
Mm-hmm.
you had your Democrats your Democratic party members who would, create their own shows, right? And so what ended up happening over time, I think that it was civil, although people stuck to their points. And then over time, what ended up happening is the more exposure you get, now you have to kind of dig in more. You have to dig into your views more. You can never admit you're wrong. You can never take anything back, especially if your views are aligned with the quote unquote party that you represent. So I think over time, after that Deregulation Act, what we found is that although our political parties were still kind of working together to get some things done, in the 80s and the 90s, around early 2000, it seemed to me around that period, that's when everything seemed to be really, really polarizing.
Mm-hmm.
I remember when, after President Clinton was elected and President Bush came into office, it was, it was a pretty polarizing time. And I could clearly remember in my mind distinctly thinking, wow, this is like the first time that I heard, a lot of my Democratic friends say, wow, I just can't stand it. But not just I can't stand that president. It was like on a regular basis. And when I look back on it in retrospect, there were so many shows that were out there at the time. And then you can look at even when Clinton was in office, there were so many conservatives who just did not like the Clintons to this day. That feeling of not liking the Clintons, especially amongst the conservative groups in the country, it is still there. Like there's a downright hatred for the Clintons. And that's because of the information that was fed to people and given to people, truthful or not truthful. Either way, there was an image that was painted. And so I think that's what has happened. I think people now have relied solely on media to tell them, everything that's going on, but not necessarily realize who's in it for the numbers and the fame and who's in it really to be the truth finders. And I think that's where the line has to be drawn sometimes when we look at what's going on, who's really telling the truth, who's just really trying to get ratings.
And yeah, you bring up a really good point there. And I want to get back to the party system again, and then we'll talk
Yeah.
about media, which is something we can't ignore because, in a sense, it is morphed the conversation even more. So, the moderates,
Yeah.
the poor moderate that has both conservative fiscally views, but have very open-minded and accepting views of social responsibility. Um,
Right.
there's not a place for that guy anymore. It's it just and if he raises his hand and says, but I'm fiscal responsible, but I do believe we need to protect our social programs. That poor guy's going to get beat up, and
Well,
depending on where he
Bill, I
lands.
do agree.
Yeah.
I agree with you. Yeah, you know what? I think what has happened with the polarization, the moderates, which moderate or in the middle, right? So there are people who have all these different views, but I would subscribe that most people in any political party actually have probably what are called quote unquote liberal views and quote unquote conservative views. So what it comes down to, I think, for most people is that they vote either the way their family has always voted or their parents. And I can tell you, specifically within the Black community is strongly Democratic uh, base, simply because the number one thing that most Black people actually care about eradicating is racism.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Democratic Party has gotten on board with saying, well, we're for this now. I can critique the Democratic Party to say that in a lot of major cities, some conservatives are right. They could probably do better in terms of listening to the people and putting policies in place. But when it comes to, being conservative, um, a lot of African Americans have conservative views, although they're predominantly with the Democratic Party. And the reason is because to many African Americans, they feel that if racism can be eradicated, that will open up everything. That can open up economic opportunities. That can open up a whole lot of things for African Americans, right? I think, when you look at uh, conservatives, many of these individuals, we tend to stereotypically think of a conservative as somebody in a rural town, but there are conservatives in big cities, and some of these people they enjoy hanging out with people of different uh, social economic backgrounds, but they might believe in fiscal responsibility, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, which is usually a big platform of the Republican Party. However, you know, President Clinton he balanced the budget. Now he's a Democrat. Now this is something that's supposed to be a Republican principle. I know President Barack Obama, that was one of his goals, to balance the budget. And, under many of the Republican presidents, there's been a lot of spending, and a lot of that spending has gone toward war and other things. So it seems like, although each party says they stand for something, sometimes you find a party who says they stand for something, the other party is actually implementing that strategy. So then where do we draw the line? And I think that's where moderates kind of came in to say, well, no, we kind of see it both ways. But right now, with the polarization of our system, it's just like there are two gangs right now. That's how I view it. It's sort of like a gang mentality. It's like, this is my gang, this is my gang over here, and I don't care about the bad things that this one gang is doing. As long as I get ahead and get the stuff done that I need done, I don't care. So I'll turn a blind eye to everything else.
Yeah. It doesn't seem like there's a whole meeting point at the aisle anymore. If there is a meeting point, it's a fight. That seems like what it
Yeah,
is. Something interesting I would like to get your opinion about. Never before have I seen this, but a fracturing of each party. If you notice, there's a thing called the Lincoln Project right now, which are
right.
quite a few, in fact, a lot of disenchanted Republicans who believe the word conservatism, and yes, I could pronounce it because I actually used to call myself one, is being bastardized, for lack of a better term. Their representation of being a conservative is no longer what it used to be. And
Right.
so they've stood up and declared change and is fighting Trumpism, extreme right wingism, with the Lincoln Project, which is pretty much endorsing the Biden ticket to fight Trump, basically. And then you now have on the opposite side, and it's happened locally here in Lake County, where we've had some Democratic elected officials jump over to the Republican Party. And I think, is starting to what they claim, because I want to talk about this a bit because it blends right into a topic we need to talk about. What the Democrats that left to go to the Republican Party claim that they cannot support the extreme views of the Democratic Party any longer. So they are moving over to a party which is not totally reflective of what they believe, but is more reflective. And I really think this has been caused by, I'm afraid to say, is the Black Lives Matter movement, because of what happened and really, unfortunately, the misrepresentation of that movement. Can you speak to that? What's happened with when it started? what it was intended to do, and the unfortunate instances that caused it to be skewed in the public's eyes.
Yeah, so the Black Lives Matter movement originally came about to really address the systemic racism in terms of Black citizens and their interactions with police officers. And so what the organization was intentionally meant to do was just to bring light to the subject through protests, to say this is something that really needs to be addressed. We've been addressing it for years in our country, right? And so what has happened over time with the consistent shooting of police, involved shootings of pretty much unarmed Black people, and more so unarmed Black men. And with the advent of social media and just being able to see these videos on a regular basis, what it has done is it has galvanized people to the point where individuals say, okay, I cannot pretend like this isn't being done on a daily basis because I see so many videos. And let's think about the videos that are not being recorded, right? I mean, they're I know on my feed, I get a lot of these videos and it just breaks my heart every time I see them, right?
Yeah.
And so that's the original intent of the movement, it was really to address police brutality. It wasn't really designed to address, a lot of other issues in the beginning. That was the start of that organization. And just like most things, when you start it, such as the Black Lives Matter movement, the intent is good. And I do believe the intent of the movement is still good. Okay. I personally do believe that what has happened and why some people are at a point where they're like, well, I don't know about the movement, is because there are so many different people that have been drawn to some of the protests. And I think what people do is they tend to associate in the current times, they see, okay, there are Black Lives Matter protests. And let's be honest, the Black Lives Matter movement, there are only certain chapters. So there are a lot of people who aren't necessarily a chapter of Black Lives Matter, but they believe in the mantra of Black Lives Matter. So it's really not even meant to be a political statement by any stretch of the imagination. For somebody to say that lives matter, it really shouldn't be anything political about that, right?
Right.
But unfortunately, that's what it has come to. And now you have people who have gone to the Black Lives Matter protests. And in any protest, it's not just Black Lives Matter. Let's look at any protest or any point in history. We can go to what started the American Revolution, pretty much a protest, a riot, dumping tea in the harbor, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
that led to pretty much a war with England eventually. That led to England coming over and shooting a few citizens, and then that was a declaration of war. And then the country found itself fighting for independence. So what I will say over time is that I think what has happened in our romantic view of America is that it was okay for our pretty much our white forefathers to actually partake in some of that activity and fight for the rights of the country and to free the country from England. But then when you have citizens within the country who are just really trying to peacefully protest to fight for equal rights, and then you have an element that comes. These elements have been a part of practically every protest. You have the people who come to speak their voice. You have the people who riot, they just want to shout. Then you have people who are just highly frustrated and they loot. It doesn't matter, honestly, when you look at some of the most violent ones, it doesn't really matter the skin color. Those tend to be the three groups that are at a lot of these protests. So what I want everybody to understand is Black Lives Matter is not this big political movement. It wasn't really designed that way. But what has happened over time is that the looting and the protests have been associated with Black Lives Matter. And probably what has turned off many, white Americans is that they were like, well, I was with you guys, and then, there's protests. And believe it or not, a lot of African Americans do not care for the looting and the rioting. It's really just a small fraction of people who do it. It's just you see a lot of people is shown on the news all the time, right?
Right.
And so that's what has happened with the movement and why it's been skewed to some degree. But what I want to say to everyone is you have to understand there is intersectionality to everything, and there's a reason why people do things. I don't condone rioting. I don't condone looting. Nobody does. But I think what we have to understand is that it doesn't matter where you are. There are people of all races who will do crazy stuff to get a point across or to get attention. And unfortunately, when you look at things like the Civil Rights Act of 1968, or, you had the first portion in 1965, Lyndon Johnson signed the 1968 Act because America was literally burning.
Right.
And let me just give you a quick picture of what it means to have frustration, as, an African American sometimes. When you're engaged with the police, you probably are being profiled from the time you're 10. And a lot of people, by the time they're 17, imagine that's 17 years of being profiled. However, you don't have the tools, you don't know how to cope with that. And for most people who've never been in that situation, they may think they would not be frustrated, but it can create frustration. It can create a sense of anger. And then when those situations come about, some people, they don't know how to channel that anger because the anger and frustration is real. Now, do I condone all of the negative things with the movement? No, I do not. But
Well,
here's what is the difference probably between, some of my white brothers and sisters who see this and some of my black brothers and sisters. Our black brothers and sisters, they see it and they're like, that's wrong. It's truly wrong for that stuff to happen. But how many times do we have to ask peacefully and we're just dismissed? And then that group of people who can't take it anymore, it's like a volcano and it's just ready to erupt.
right.
And that's what you see with the looting, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And
One
yeah.
thing, because we're going to run out of time here, so I
Oh,
want to
sorry.
get to another topic that is really another court. The issue has caused a lot of unrest in both parties. When this started happening recently, the
Mhm.
words defund the police started getting thrown
Yeah.
around. And with our media, where they stand, they again love to exploit things for the benefit of views and for the wrong reasons. Let's put it that way. Really, what we were looking at, which a lot of everyone pretty much agreed on, um, right now there's been a lot of problem with violence in Chicago, just not with the Black Lives Matter, but shootings and so on. And there was a conversation to be had about, the police departments are tasked with an awful lot in
Yeah.
social responsibilities that really they're not trained to do. And so the discussion said, should we take part of the police budget and move it over to social workers or to social departments that are better equipped to handle some of the problems that are happening in some of the impoverished neighborhoods? And that got blown up by accusing the police, oh, we're going to start firing police because of the aggressive behavior. Now, I will say there is a total, and I think if you talk to a lot of police officers, yes, there are a lot of things that they need to take responsibility for. But unfortunately, what this has done is put, and this I really have to accuse the media of, putting a target on police officers who are really good police officers, and that they've been put in the line of fire that they really don't deserve to be there. And I think this has caused a lot of people to really rethink their alignment with the particular party because of that. Unfortunately, I think that is miscommunicated, and we all need to take a step back. Yeah, this show
Yeah.
is extremely supportive of our law enforcement community. Some of our best friends are either sheriffs, U.S. marshals, or police officers, and we love those guys to death, and they do the right thing, and they keep us safe. But unfortunately, what it's caused is a rift in the law enforcement community and people aligning themselves with the law enforcement community that again puts another taint on the Black Lives Matter movement. And before we go, I'd like to, because one of the things that has really been misrepresented, um, and right after Rodney King, I guess we had police officers being sued and being charged with crimes. Then George Floyd happened, and that's where we all saw what happened and began some of the really uneasy conversations about, well, what are the numbers? What's happening here? And so right away, people said, well, it's hugely affecting the African American community, which it is, but they didn't understand that. And what I always dislike, people always look at the aggregate numbers without understanding the balance of difference in population. So right away, the other side said, well, far more white people got shot than black people. That is not the way to look at it. That's a this unfair representation. So I'm going to, and we need to move on here because I need to wrap up the show. But so if you look at per 1 million people, the black community suffered 6.6% loss due or rate of death due to extreme police violence. The Hispanic community suffered 3.8%. The white community, and this is what, again, we're looking at per capita type of comparison, is 2.5% rate of death. So these are the boiled down numbers of the impact in these communities. So the conversation is still the black community is unfairly being impacted by aggressive police behavior. And in case of George Floyd, it was evident to everyone. There's no conversation there. This was an outright, and then shortly after that, other things started coming up. So that is something I wanted to get up in the conversation. And unfortunately, it's caused fragmented conversation and misinterpretation all over the place. But that's it. I mean, it seems like unfair on both sides. The police officers are now being treated unfairly, and the Black Lives Matter movement is now being tainted and being accused of things that was never really their original intent. So, uh, what are your views about how we can bring this together? What kind of conversations do we need to have to get people at the table and talk this through so we can get things done? Because until we have honest conversations about real numbers, not misinterpreted numbers, and real conversations about what the intent of human rights, true human rights in the United States, we're never going to get anywhere.
Absolutely. And you know what? See, the unfortunate part is the unfortunate thing is that a lot of people think that things don't come down to race, but I can tell you most of our problems come down to race.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so what we have to understand is when it comes down to race, it's not that, we're saying that all police officers are bad, because even the people in the Black Lives Matter movement, even the black community, people forget, we have family members who are police officers. We have family members who are in the military. And I think
Mm-hmm.
oftentimes when it comes to our community, people don't view us as having those relatives who are part of like the military or part of the police department. So we, by no stretch of the imagination, think that the world will be safer without police, right?
Right.
And so I think within the white community, the police officers are the heroes. The soldiers, they're the heroes. And they are the heroes within the black community. But then we have so many other struggles we have to deal with. The activist is the hero in our community, right? The school teacher, we consider that person a hero in our community. So I think that's where we get into some of our disagreements about, how do we view these particular entities. And to be honest, let's be honest, most of the people who view, and I'm not saying there aren't any black people who don't view the Black Lives Matter movement as, having, people who loot, but most people who are black don't really associate the looters with the intent of the Black Lives Matter movement, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then what ends up happening, even for well-intentioned white people, if you lived in a situation where you've never had to deal with those type of issues, where you've never had to deal with systemic racism, where you never had to deal with police violence, how can you really know what that feels like? You can't. So
Right.
the only thing that you can do is really be open to listen. I don't know what it's like to be a woman, but I know what it feels like to have people look at me differently because of the way I look, because of the color of my skin. So I can empathize, right? And so I think what we have to learn to do is we may not understand each other's situations, but we have to empathize with each other. That's number one. That's how we can draw the gap. My white brothers and sisters, you guys have to start listening to the stories more, because you can come in with your lens and your perspective, but until you walk in my shoes, you really don't know. You
Mm,
really don't know. So
that
it
is
takes
so
really
true.
having an open mind, because there are certain things that we have to take into account when it comes to diversity. That also creates perception. Perceptions then create our thoughts and how we view some of these movements. And so I do think that the intent of Black Lives Matter is good. When it comes to defund the police, I'll be honest, for me, I thought it was the wrong terminology,
Yeah.
because defund the police, I think that's wrong terminology. I think what we should have said was maybe reallocation of resources, because look at the Highland community. You know why the police force isn't as heavy? Because you have so many things within the community. You have a community center.
Mm-hmm.
You have all these events you can do in town, but you
Right.
don't really have that in the inner city. So now, guess what? If you put more money into the police force instead of making the citizens better, then what's going to happen? Those people still don't have resources, and now some people are going to probably do stuff that they probably don't want to do. Some people just like doing crazy things,
Yeah.
in some of these communities. But some people are trying to survive, right? But then the system is really set up to where the police officers heavily monitor the Black communities, but you don't have to monitor the white communities heavily. Although the rate of drugs are done about the same, crime is really not that different in each community. There may be certain types of crimes where one community may do it more than the other, right? But overall, crimes are really not that different in each of these communities. So I think what ends up happening is, over time, Black people start to become a little disenfranchised with the police, because just imagine, we're men, and so there's situations where we're expected to be alphas, right? But imagine when you're a man and the alpha is supposed to be your hero, that hero is then throwing you against a car. That will
Yeah.
completely change your perception on the person who you're entrusting to protect you. And so, for within the white community, there is a lot of harassment,
Yeah.
and so for Black people, it's not really to fund the police, is let's allocate some resources to give these communities things that they need. Really, this whole defund strategy or reallocation really looks like the suburbs. And
Yeah.
I think that was Congresswoman Cortez. She kind of had a statement where she talked about this, and I said, yeah, that's exactly what it looks like, because we've been talking about these things in the Black community for years. We're like, we'll just put up more community centers, put up more things for the kids to do, and then what you'll find is the crime will go down. That will probably deter some of the police behavior, but then you probably don't need the number of cops. You can actually reward the cops who are really doing their job, because we like great police too, because if there's an issue, we're calling the police.
Yeah.
If there's
They,
something we can't solve, it
they,
doesn't
they
matter who you are. You're calling the police anyway.
they keep us safe. There's no
Yeah,
two ends about it. And that, like I said, they a lot. There are two sides of both taking an unfair hit on this,
absolutely.
and we just need to sit back. And Kevin, I hate to do. I hate to do this because we've had conversation about this, and I think
Yeah,
we need to have another, not just another couple of shows to talk about this, and maybe invite some people on to have further conversation. Unfortunately, I've
absolutely.
got to roll out another show at in just a couple of minutes. So, but this is such a serious topic. We do need to further it and sit down and invite some people to the table and take a deeper dive in these situations. So, but
Absolutely.
Kevin, boy, I can't tell you how much we appreciate you coming on the show and talking about some of these issues. And they do need hours more, days more, years more conversation so we can boil this down and make it clear for people to see. Because that's it.
Absolutely.
And I will leave with saying this: media needs to rethink the way they portray. As I was watching the coverage of the Democratic um, conference yesterday, it it seems like the role of the media is totally changed from Walter Cronkite, where your job was to report the story, not what you thought was happening. And when I
Absolutely.
saw both Fox and CNN, I'm like, this is wrong. This has got to be fixed.
Yeah,
It
and
totally, it is doing nothing but pouring gasoline on a raging inferno. And
Absolutely.
so I really think there needs to be a change in the media and how they view the days of Walter Cronkite have to come back to where we objectively report what's going on and leave the editorial for an editorial section, but not blend it into the reporting, which unfortunately is not happening. And
Absolutely.
I just made some enemies of my fellow media people, but with that, listen, I do have to wrap up here. I do have to go down with another show. Kevin, we appreciate you. We appreciate everything that the Highland Unite Against Hate is doing, because that is something that there should be no room for anywhere on this great earth is hate. It has no place in it. It drives people further apart and causes damage to our beautiful communities and beautiful people. So I'll leave you with that. Any closing words you want to say before we go?
Yeah, before we go, Bill, thank you so much for having me on this show. I really appreciate that. And, just a few things. I just want to say to everybody that my lovely wife, Alencia Ballard, she's actually going to run for the school board. So we talk about change, and getting involved, as people who need to have their voices heard. Sometimes these are the things we have to do to make changes within our community. We have to serve in some of these posts. The other thing I want to say before we go is I want to definitely say much respect to, the veterans and even to our police officers, because one of my good friends in town is a police officer, and,
Yeah.
we talk and we may have different views about different things, but you know what, at the end of the day, he's a good guy. And, I always want him to come home safe. And then to all those families who have, children who are African American, they want their family to come home safe. So what I'm saying is everybody wants the same thing overall. And, again, much respect to our police officers, much respect to our veterans, and much respect to our activists and our freedom fighters and everybody who makes up the microcosm of America, which is what makes this country so great. We appreciate you all, and trust me, those of us who believe in Black Lives Matter, we are not against you. Believe me, we are not against the ones who do what they're supposed to do. Not at all. We just want to root out whatever we can and make the world better, not just for African Americans, but for everyone. So I appreciate you, Bill. Appreciate your time. Thank you so much for having
We
me.
appreciate you. And with that, we'll wrap up the show. And Kevin, have a very safe, enjoyable evening. And everyone out there, please be safe. And please always remember to treat your neighbor with care and kindness. And we'll say goodbye for now.
This episode of The Bill and Callie Show is brought to you by...
Hurt in a wreck, why would you even think about calling the insurance company first?
Call someone who's going to work for you, not against you.
The insurance companies are not on your side. We are.
We are Lerner and Rowe.
Lerner and Rowe are the lawyers for you. Call 222-2222.